Hello and welcome to the Healthy Materials series. After a year of COVID-19, environmental crises, and calls for social justice, healthy materials could not be more important. We have seen the air polluted with carbon from the extraction of raw materials. We have seen manufacturing plants release toxic byproducts into the air and water, compromising neighborhoods predominantly of color. We have seen contagion spread through our buildings, ill-equipped to suppress such viruses and bacteria. We have seen fires burn toxicity into our air, poisoning our firefighters and neighbors. Now is the time to reimagine the products of our built environment. The local American Institute of Architects Committee on the Environment, Carbon Leadership Forum, and US Green Building Council chapters in San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles present the Healthy Materials Series, a 6-part program exploring the true impacts of material choice. The AIA COTE serves as the voice of AIA architects on sustainable design, building sciences, and performance. The Carbon Leadership Forum's mission is to eliminate embodied carbon in buildings and infrastructure by inspiring innovation and spurring change through collective action. USGBC LA is committed to transforming the way our buildings are designed, constructed, and operated through LEED. In this first episode, we will introduce a holistic methodology for approaching healthy materials and set the scene for our discussion. Ruchi Shah and Jack Dinning will guide us through the definition of healthy. Ruchi has 7+ years of experience in sustainability across the real estate and consulting sector. Earlier this month, she transitioned from the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, an affordable housing developer in San Francisco, where she led sustainability efforts and supported the design teams and led green certification efforts such as LEED, LBC, and particularly focused on integrating healthy materials in affordable multifamily projects. Ruchi has received an Environmental Service Award from the San Francisco Commission for her contribution to affordable housing. Ruchi has worked at Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, a collaborative of 13 affordable housing developers, and Avalon Bay, a national real estate investment trust, developing sustainability programs and managed green construction projects. She holds a master's in sustainability from the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's in biotechnology engineering. She's a LEED Green Associate, a Fitwel Ambassador, WELL AP, and is pursuing her Living Future accreditation. Jack Dinning is a designer, researcher, and material health and sustainability strategist working with Brightworks Sustainability in Harvard University's Office for Sustainability. Having began in architectural practice and understanding the impacts that toxic materials can have on vulnerable populations, he now works to create tools and strategies that will empower fellow designers and drive collective progress in the industry. He has also led educational initiatives with the Healthy Materials Lab at Parsons School of Design and continues to co-lead the Mindful Materials Education Working Group. His work has earned recognitions, including an invitation to the United Nations Global Compact Leaders Summit, the Alpha Rokai Medal for Leadership and Professional Merit, and election to the inaugural class of AIA New York's Civic Leadership Program. Together, they open our definition of healthy. But first, Mallow Hudson will present our keynote address. Mallow is an associate professor and the director of the Urban Community and Health Equity Lab in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. He is also an associate member of the Earth Institute faculty at Columbia University and co-director of the Urbanism Research Group at the Columbia Population Research Center. For the past 2 years, he was the director of project development for Columbia World Projects, a university-wide initiative to use research and scholarship to address societal challenges. His research focuses on community development and health equity, built environment and health, and urban sustainability/circular economy, both domestically and internationally. His current research includes an analysis of gentrification and displacement of vulnerable populations and its impact on health, the impacts of disaster management and recovery in Chile, and analysis of the food system in the state of California. He earned his BA and master's degree, both from the University of California at Berkeley and his PhD from MIT. Starting July 1st, 2021, Hudson will be the Dean and Edward E. Elson Professor of Architecture at the University of Virginia's School of Architecture. Congrats, Mallow. And before I hand the mic to Mallow, a note about today's session. After we hear the presentations, we'll break into a panel discussion and Q&A. We hope this series leads to working groups, initiatives, and future conversations. So feel free to add your contact info to the Google Sheet in the chat, contribute notes to the Google Doc discussion forum, also in the chat, And check out the CLF SF Healthy Materials landing page for recordings of the event and episode notes. Jacqueline, if you can drop those into the chat, that would be great. And Mallow, feel free to take us away.
Great. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for having me, the sponsors of this wonderful series. I mean, I was delighted to hear that this was even taking place when I was contacted, I guess, in January, February of this year. And so I just want to say I can't think of anything more important than trying to address these issues that you're talking about in the 6-part series. So I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be a part of it. I'm also very happy to be with Jack Denning and Ruchi Shah because I've admired the work that they do. So it's great to be a part of that. And more importantly, I would say that I want to thank you for not just talking about real social change, but actually being about it and thinking about health equity, social justice, and the importance of healthy materials and how we can improve the overall lives of the everyday person. And with that said, we are approaching the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And I would like it if we could just take a few seconds of silence to think about where we've all been this past year and where we're headed. And I think this is a great way to start this series. So if we could just take a few minutes of silence. Okay, with that said, I'm going to share my screen and get in today. You all are so generous to call it a keynote. It's probably more of a framing for today's discussion and just talk about where we've been. And so the title of my talk today is really, how do we build a healthy and more sustainable environments? And many of you are doing this. And so I just want to lay out from my perspective, the more macro level perspective of this, and then open the stage up to Jack and Ruchi to talk about their respective work. So I always like to start off my presentations with giving you some background. And so I come from very humble beginnings. My family and I moved around quite a bit. And through moving around, little did I know that was going to shape my interest in the built environment. But I was moving from one school to another school, seeing different communities in the built environment, looking at the transportation networks. And I saw the big differences all across Southern California, really from San Diego all the way up to Los Angeles to the Inland Empire. And being someone that was in a poor household, we knew the importance of public transportation and all the things that we discuss and will discuss today. That got me quite interested in community development and more recently health equity and thinking about the circular economy. So you can't really talk about community development without thinking about the environment, about thinking about people, and then of course, really getting into the issues around climate change and climate resilience. And so when I was a doctoral student at MIT, I became, I sort of went down this rabbit hole of being very interested in improving people's quality of life. And it was really my colleagues in the biosciences or in public health that said, well, what do you mean by improving people's quality of life? Are you really talking about mortality and morbidity? Because that's really what it comes down to is people's overall health. And so I had the pleasure and great fortune to work with colleagues at the University of Michigan and the School of Public Health that were really interested in these broader questions about the built environment and whether and how that might be affecting our cardiovascular disease, our physical activity, people who are interested in buildings and the history of buildings, especially looking at new materials that we're trying to develop. And so all of that really shaped the work I do today. So I like to just give a little bit of background for those who are, on different paths. Most of my work really can be classified at the intersection of urban planning, the built environment, and health equity. I'm interested, why does place matter for health? What factors or pathways matter the most? I'm also interested in institutions and the distribution of resources. And so I'm quite pleased with the groups that are that have signed up for today's discussion and for the other 5-part series that will be after this one. Because I do think that as leaders, as those who are in big institutions, we really can move the needle to bring about some of these changes that we need to see. And so, this has really shaped who I am. And if we're to look at this, was developed by one of my mentors, George Kaplan, who is a social epidemiologist. And if we think at the broadest level, sort of the social and economic policies, and I know This is what many of my colleagues at the Carbon Leadership Forum are thinking about. What can we do from a policy perspective, all the way down really to the individual level, thinking about epigenetics. So how do our genetics interact with the environment? And just thinking about obviously our genetic factors, but then thinking about the individual risk factors. So we spend lots of our time in buildings, and I'll get into that later, but all the way up through social relationships, and then neighborhoods and communities. As we all know, and you're well aware that now is the time, right? It's time for action, and we're in a very unique time. I mean, if you all were like me last summer, we're in the middle of COVID. We were in the middle of looking at racial injustice, not just in the United States, but around the world. And we probably all went through that moment of wondering, when are things going to start to get better? And I would say that, through these difficult challenges are opportunities. And I think we see that now. I think many people, we've dusted ourselves off. We hope to be coming out of the COVID-19 global pandemic. We know that many of our colleagues around the world and our friends and loved ones are still suffering. But we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully, to then move forward. And just like Brian said in the introduction, we can think about how we can build differently. We can think about what we can do differently. And so I think it's the perfect opportunity not only to think about climate change and climate resilience, but to really also think about health inequities, social justice, racial justice, especially as it pertains to the built environment, which was so eloquently laid out at the beginning of today's introduction. When I think about climate justice, there are a number of opportunities to build more resilient ecosystems and more sustainable societies. I know I say sustainable society, but in fact, it's many societies, right? When you're thinking about different parts of the world, but thinking about priority areas from coastal viability to thinking about disaster preparedness, circular economy, the role of big data, data science, all the way to carbon reduction and carbon capture. I was invited to the UN a few years back by the Secretary General to have a conversation about, what are we going to do about our greenhouse gas emissions and the reality of carbon emissions in our society. And one of the things that became very clear is, one, we need to think about our energy production and how we change our energy production. Two, we have to think about just our production system in general, right? And so we know that we are always consuming, but really think about the consume, how we think about our consumption, products and how they're delivered and so forth. And then two things that really stuck out to me were, as much as we, for my colleagues in San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York or Mumbai or London, the big cities of the world, we know that we're talking about climate change, climate resilience, and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But one thing that came through from this meeting is that it's really going to take the medium-sized and small-sized cities to make a difference. So we need to focus on regional development. That was something that came through from all the scientists, is how do we think about regional development in a more integrated, holistic way? And then focusing on local land use planning, right? So those two things, in addition to production and energy efficiency, were critical for us getting to where we need to be in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So that puts us in the center of this conversation as architects, designers, planners, and those in related fields. As you know, that we've seen the increasing intensity of storms. So through the work I've been, with my colleagues at Columbia University at the Earth Institute, and now we just launched our new climate school that will start in the fall. You see this intensity, right, with the modeling of storms, seeing what's happening, the increase in wildfires, as you see this picture of California. This is from courtesy of the Los Angeles Times. And we know many parts of the world are getting drier. There's uneven rainfall. So you just have to look to Australia. You could look to Chile. You could look to California. You could look to Greece. Places that have these Mediterranean climates or more warmer climates are really starting to be impacted in a great way. And along with that are the atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns. So all of this, right? And so it just framing this to say the time is now, it was yesterday. And I'm happy to see that we're trying to do that given our respective professions. And if you haven't seen the study that's come out by Princeton, I will find a way to put it in the chat. They really lay out a comprehensive plan to how we need to get there by 2050. It's quite an impressive document, and they've passed that on to the Biden and Harris administrations. Now, on the flip side of that also is that when we think about health inequities, racial and social justice, especially within the built environment, as I said earlier, we know that many people of color, more vulnerable populations, poor populations, whether it be in the rural or urban areas, are impacted by this, right? And so place matters for health, as you've heard over and over, where we eat, sleep, play, work, worship, all of this matters for our health. So essentially, it boils down to where you live, your zip code matters. We spend roughly 90% of our life indoors. And so much of what we're going to talk about today is obviously the buildings, the built environment, the indoor exposures that we have to different toxic air pollution and so forth. All of that is incredibly important. And if we were to look at the literature, whether it be, expanding social epidemiology all the way to the biosciences, you'll see people talking about the different toxic chemicals in the environment and who the populations are that are the most vulnerable. So when we think about children, certainly they are being impacted in a great way, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But also, farm and migrant workers. I know many of you are in California now. I consider California as my home. I still have a house in Berkeley, and I like to spend my summers there. But just a trip to the Central Valley, you see the farm and migrant workers and the kind of exposures that they have to pesticides and to all other kind of chemicals, as well as the urban poor population. So, also being in New York City, I see it within the city of New York, the disproportionate impact of inequities in the built environment and what impact it has on communities, whether we're talking about public housing, whether we're talking about housing that's near the expressways, housing that doesn't have the kind of protective things you would expect in the environment, such as trees and open space, things that more affluent communities we may take for granted. And so that's a big issue, as well as people living in rural or isolated populations, right? Or areas, I should say. They are also affected by toxic chemicals, air pollution, and all these other things that we're going to talk about today. And so all the way from that to looking at specific racial minority groups or people of color, so Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Black and Latinx populations, and so forth. The data is overwhelming of the inequities, and you can look at people's work from Manuel Pastor to Rachel Morello-Frosch to a whole host of many other people that are doing great work, thinking about this from the more community or socio-ecological perspective. One of the things that I think about in my own work is the focus on really families and children. So really women and children is a big part of my work. And it really breaks your heart when you look at the data. And I know there are colleagues doing great work at Harvard that Jack may talk about, and some of the stuff that Jack's looking at, is that they're just so vulnerable to these toxic effects of being exposed to chemicals, right? It impacts their physical and cognitive development. We see that in New York City around public housing, where children are being exposed to lead paint and other types of chemicals, and what that does long term for their cognitive development. And so these are things that we really need to pay attention to, especially when you think about all the other pollutants, whether it be pesticides, lead, mercury, arsenic, and so forth. All of these are great challenges for us to address in our environments and find ways to protect children. And so looking at the Healthy Building Network, they say it really succinctly: chemicals that are prohibited from children's products are ubiquitous in the floors, carpets, artificial turf, playground surfaces and furniture that we interact with. And so you can see that, wherever we turn, especially for young people, they're being exposed to these chemicals, and with their little bodies, it really can have a serious impact. And so clearly the environment's important, but certainly if you can't get people active to do something, hopefully if we talk about the impact on children, that will motivate people to do even more. And then, I don't want to just be the person who's spouting out all these negative statistics. I think that one of the nice things about this group is you're active, you're action oriented, you're policy oriented. And I have to say, as I tell my students and when I talk to my colleagues, is, one of the things is we think about what's happening now around the world. We're in the conversation, whether we're talking, whether you're an architect, a landscape architect, a planner, or someone, urban designer, or you study architectural history, we're part of this conversation right now, whether we're talking about the social and racial justice in the built environment. When you think about how do people interact, what the importance of plazas, the importance of open space, the importance of buildings, how do we interact with one another, right? Our integrated transportation networks and so forth, or lack thereof. All this is quite important, all the way to climate resiliency, and then building healthier communities, and then, of course, addressing the environmental degradation. So we're there. And if you were, as I was reading lots of background materials that have been put out by our colleagues, I mean, you see the AIA Healthy Materials Pledge, you have organizations like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the UK, really focusing on circular cities and what we can do, whether it be from food systems to our transportation network, to land use, to product development, to transport. I mean, it's all there, right? Of thinking about how do we build in a more efficient way, a more healthier way? How do we incorporate more healthier materials into our building products, or into our buildings and so forth? So it's incredibly important. And of course, the Carbon Leadership Forum, the focus on embodied carbon building materials, and sort of looking at that all the way through to the construction of a building. And I'm delighted that you'll have people like David Benjamin, my colleague at Columbia, who's quite interested in all of these issues as well. And so, I think there's a lot of work that is being done, a lot more work that can be done. And I would say that I'm feeling more optimistic as we move forward. I know the challenges are great, but there are opportunities to really make a difference. I just want to take a moment to talk about, in my own kind of perspective. So in the case of New York City, as I mentioned earlier, when I moved here, coming from the Bay Area, getting heavily involved with what was happening in New York, I had the opportunity to host a session with, from the governor's office all the way to the mayor's office in New York City, and other local elected officials and nonprofit organizations, really focused on the issue of housing policy, affordable housing in New York City. And one of the things that came up that was very apparent is there are a number of older buildings, a large number of public housing. So if we're to think about the number of residents in the public housing developments in New York City, it's equivalent to the size of Milwaukee, right? And so it's quite significant. Many of the buildings need quite a bit of renovation. So there's inadequate heating systems, mold, rat infestations, exposure to lead paint, other toxic chemicals, leaky roofs, broken elevators. And one of the things that also had a major impact was Superstorm Sandy that came through, and many of the electrical equipment were in the basements of some of these buildings. And so that, once the seawater and other water came through, really damaged the buildings. And so they've had to go through a lot of repairs, moving much of the building, the operating building equipment up on other floors. You see that across the board in New York with hospitals and other important buildings. We're really rethinking the way we build and how we move things to the third, fourth floor, so in some cases even putting on the rooftops. So all of this is an opportunity. And if you start to look at, again, the children that are exposed to these different toxic chemicals, it's quite disturbing. And so one of the things that I've tried to do now with my colleagues is I've gotten involved with Michael Nutter and his wife, Lisa Nutter. Michael Nutter is the former mayor of Philadelphia. He has launched this partnership for social and economic mobility, the Social Mobility Impact Fund, essentially. And it's operating it right now in New York City, Philadelphia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of the things this fund is trying to do is really bring in investors, not your typical investors, but investors who are willing to really focus on the benefit of the community, the broader social good, in partnership with community residents, as opposed to just coming in and saying, this is what needs to happen, but really trying to work in partnership to bring about the real change. And so one of the things I've floated is this idea of saying, well, what do we do with these older buildings? What do we do with public housing? And so I've tried to work with my colleagues to do this eco community retrofit project. It's really focusing on taking the built environment as well as public health and bringing it together. So much of what we're talking about today. And how do you create more affordable housing? How do you create sustainable circular housing? Really focusing on carbon neutral, energy efficient housing. So thinking about the building materials, the roofs, the solar panels, smart controls, gray water reuse. I mean, you understand where I'm going with this. And so that's one component, really thinking about the physical side of this. But then there's a side of for the people, right, in the community, and sort of how do you really think about it from a public health component, right? And so thinking about interventions by working with local governments, even federal in some cases, or state, depending on the type of program we might be looking at, as well as nonprofit entities and community residents, to be a part of the process of saying, look, these are the things we need, this is what we care about. Ironically, and maybe it's not ironic, but as we think about the disinvestment, there's been a lot of talk about redlining and all of these things. In a place like New York and all these urban cities, one of the things that we have to our advantage is location, right? So, in the case of, say, San Francisco, with the cost of housing, people are moving further and further out. And so that becomes a big challenge, and not enough housing is being built. I don't have to tell my colleagues in California, you all know this quite well. But in New York City, we still do have a lot of housing and public housing within the city. Now, it's not of the best quality, but it's still there in the city. And so people still are, from a locational perspective, able to access Central Park, the subway system, large institutions that are important to people's lives. And so that's something we've been focusing quite a bit on, and what do you do there? And then let me just wrap up, because I think it's a conversation really needs to be had around all these things, and certainly after Jack and Ruchi present. But I just really, as I was thinking about, well, what can we do? I mean, there's many things we can do, but I didn't need to look really much further than the Carbon Leadership Forum and my colleagues there, and the kind of things that they've been talking about, which is procurement policies and climate action plans, building codes, city zoning, land use, different regulations, executive orders. So you have that whole set of things. And then you have a whole nother different approaches, which maybe Ruchi will talk about from a community development perspective or a community engagement perspective, of saying there are also these bottom-up strategies that people are doing, right, to transform their communities. So it's not one or the other, but it's really a multi-pronged, comprehensive strategy that's breaking down the silos, that's really being integrated, that is going to take all the people we have on this this meeting today to really work together to try to bring about the change. And we were joking, my colleagues and I were joking before this started. Oftentimes when we think about architecture or planning, we're often in our own silos, right? And in fact, what we need to do is think about how complex these issues are and what we each bring to the table, not to necessarily forget who we are and how we've been trained, but to really be able to extend ourselves and say, how can I think about this from the perspective of, say, as an urban planner, as an architect, or as an urban designer, or as an epidemiologist, or as a community resident, or as a policymaker, to really try to bridge those gaps that may exist, to think about how do we work holistically to try to address some of these issues. And that's why I'm so delighted that this is a 6-part series. It's not a one-off, it's not a one-day conference, but in fact, it's a 6-part series that is designed to continue the conversation, for us to work together, for us to think about real-world solutions and how do we get there. So I'll stop there. It's just a way for us to get started, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Mal. That was fantastic. All right, I'm gonna pass on. Ruchi, you can take the screen.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you, Brian. Let me just get the screen sharing started. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome, great. First of all, thank you everyone for joining on a Monday evening, which does say something that we really care about buildings and material health. So I'm really happy to be here. One disclosure I want to make before I move further is I am really excited that I'm sharing the work that I did at TNDC. And that's why you see on the slide, I am their ex-sustainability manager. I transitioned out of that role just 2 weeks ago, but I still feel passionate about this work. And I'm thankful to CLF and TNDC to let me share what we did there with you all. So thank you, everyone. In sort of the context that we just were talking about with Malo in terms of equities, health inequities, and sort of what's the framework, I think in terms of definition, and when I was asked to think about how can we define health, I always feel it's so subjective, and it's based on where you are working, sort of what goals are. In terms of TNDC, as an affordable housing owner and developer, with almost 50 buildings in Tenderloin, San Francisco, so very regional focus, community focus, and also 10 more buildings in new construction. The lens that we took was, how can we design better? How can we solve for equity, as well as think about well-being holistically? I think housing is one part of our work. Yes, we are in the business of building homes and reducing the shortage of affordable housing in San Francisco. But there are just so many issues that we solve as part of building affordable and green homes. One thing for people who might not be familiar with Tenderloin is to think about that it's such an interesting area or a community where you will see stark sort of differences in economic aspects, socioeconomic aspects. There is a Jimmy Choo store, a high-end, most expensive store, and a few steps away, you'll find a homeless person there. And when I joined TNDC, I was amazed, I don't know in a good or a bad way, but thinking, what can I do being in the sustainability profession? So with that, and before I dive into what we did, just want to sort of highlight some of the impacts that Marlo shared, which are even more real, and I would see them firsthand when I was at TNDC. And we know that 12 million people around the world, they die every year just because of, I mean, there are many, many factors that causes death, but unhealthy environments is a big one too. And then low wealth communities, the communities that TNDC support, they are just disproportionately exposed to chemicals because of the building stock that we have in San Francisco. And then the amount of time they spend indoors, Mama also shared the same thing, 90%. And that could be even more. The population that we serve ranges from seniors to disabled people to people with no jobs, and it can vary. So that is always in back of my mind, like, are people breathing the right things, right? And then in terms of impact, we have seen from our residents itself, lead poisoning to asthma, and sort of different health impacts that they can have as a result of living in unhealthy environments. And TNDC, I'm going to share a short video just to give you all a flavor of how TNDC is integrating homes, health, and voice in our work holistically. But just to sort of highlight the gap before I dive into that is, a lot of our focus on health is about like access to healthy food or insurance, hospitals, things like access to healthcare. But often we forget how critical material health is when we look at impacts and outcomes. So before sort of diving into what we did, I also want to highlight the fact, like, who's affected. It's of course the people living in the buildings the most, but it's also manufacturers and contractors who are actually on the ground building these buildings. It's the day-to-day staff who's supporting these buildings, maintenance staff, custodial staff. And I feel that's even a more sort of compelling factor as to why material health shouldn't be left out in your decision making. So I'm going to share this quick video.
At TNDC, we believe that everyone, regardless of income or race, has a right to the basic human needs of homes, health, and voice. But that's not the reality we live in. Inequity is our reality, especially here in San Francisco, and especially in the Tenderloin. The systems we all rely on disproportionately leave people with low incomes and Black and brown people unhoused, without food, and without a say in the decisions affecting them. But we're changing that. Together, we are building a more equitable city brick by brick, by building more affordable housing, by providing social services inside and outside our buildings, by increasing healthy food options in neighborhoods without them, by advocating for and alongside communities whose voices need to be heard. Homes are the foundation of our work at TNDC, but homes cannot stand without the support of health and voice. We need all the pieces working together to make a real impact. Our food and wellness work is a great example. We recognize that food and wellness means different things to different people, cultures, and communities. Our role is not to prescribe, but to open doors. We bring food to the neighborhood, bring neighbors to the food, and bring neighbors together over food. When access to healthy food increases in communities with low incomes and communities of color, it's not just individual health that benefits. It's systemic change in action, community voice being heard, and it's less time spent worrying and more time spent creating a home. Each piece of our work in homes, health, and voice builds a better future for all. We know the road to economic and racial equity is a long one, but we are on it. We hope you will join us.
So I hope this gives you a flavor of sort of the holistic approach to health at TNDC.
At TNDC, we believe that everyone, regardless of income or race, has a right.
And in my sort of time at TNDC, the piece that I focused on sort of integrating health was to look at the opportunity in built environment. And TNDC, like I said, has a sort of older stock of buildings, 50 buildings. We have many of them coming up for renovation, and then 10 more in new construction. And what we figured out was that there is this huge gap of what is health in terms of built environment. And we really relied back in the day on our architects, thinking that if we are building a LEED building or a green point rated building, we are good to go. But that's not the case, right? We realized that even when we follow these standards, there are many, many things that are missed out, and we don't have a framework to look at health holistically. So one of the first steps that we took was to figure out who are the key stakeholders out there who are working on these issues and can support us in our journey for health and material health. So we partnered with Home Free, which is led by Healthy Building Network. They are a nonprofit, and the Home Free is a national initiative supporting affordable housing stakeholders on with tools, education, research on how to use less toxic and healthy building materials. And this partnership was, I think, the best thing TNDC decided to do, is we started with education piece first. There was a lot of unknownness, so to say, in terms of what could be done beyond following a LEED standard or a green point rated standard. So that's where we started. We also started focusing on transparency. We didn't even know, to be honest, we didn't have a good handle on the cut sheets or the things, details on the products that were being installed in our buildings because of bandwidth and capacity issues. The third thing we focused on is asking questions. So we gathered with all of our architectural teams, engineers, and sort of on a high level, starting to map out what are the gaps. What are the things that we think we could change quickly, like beyond paints, like no VOC, low VOC paints was, we were pretty good on that, but there is so much more beyond those low-hanging fruits. And then we came up with an idea, which I'll present in a bit, is how can we design better and what standards we can adopt. And lastly, through this effort, we are trying, or TNDC is trying to build capacity and scale this effort. As we have so many projects in new construction, and in the future, we are just gonna grow bigger and bigger. So one approach that we took is we had a design guidelines, or like a standard that we would hand over to every new architect or a team who's gonna build a new building or renovate. And that we thought was like the one sort of starting point where we need to integrate healthy building material resources and sort of tell them what TNDC wants and what we do not want. And even though that boundary is not always clear, but we wanted to start somewhere. So we came up with this approach in partnership with Home Free, where we are using their hazard spectrum. It's essentially a traffic light chart approach. Things in green are great on different health aspects, and red is bad. Though this is sort of a sliding scale. So we decided to take this approach for 7 high impact categories, which I'll get to in a bit, where residents are going to be in the most contact, or there could be most benefits in terms of health. So those were the criteria we used. And then when we talked to our architects, this made sense, as this gives them an option. They do not need to use linoleum in every building. It's going to be expensive, and it also doesn't work for that building application. We cannot use linoleum in a bathroom all the time. So this gives them flexibility, but yet gives them a direction of where to go. In sort of coming up with this approach, we also partnered with Healthy Materials Lab, co-leveraged several resources. We also looked at Red List Free to think about what are the things that we really want to avoid. So these sources, and I think down the lane throughout the series, people will be talking about this even more. But these were the basis of our materials guidance. Another resource that I really want to point out, which was a big help for us, is Declare database, where it's like, think about if you want water sense label product, you go to a database and see which products have that certification. Similarly on health, they have done the hard work, Declare, of screening products on some health categories. I think there's always more that can happen, but this is a great start, which tells you where does a product come from, what is it made of, and where does it go end of its life. So it looks at it holistically for product selection. Coming back sort of to the categories, we looked at, of course, paints, which we know we were pretty good at, but we really wanted to start demand transparency there, prefer products with HPDs. Flooring, we really sort of focused on two big ones. Is carpets moving forward are not acceptable at all, even though there could be green carpets, but overall, when we look holistically, there are many better products that we can use for our tenants. Non-vinyl is a big one, and I'm sure down the line we can talk more about the cost implications, but that is a big push for TNDC. Similarly, in other categories, sort of highlighting what we don't want and what we want, and then having the teams find a balance for every project. We did that for gypsum, countertops, cabinetry, millwork, and sort of these categories, which down the lane TNDC hopes to add more as our research and our partner research increases. So I want to highlight sort of to distill the work and to say, okay, great, now we have tools, we have resources, what's the next step? And what does good look like from where we started in the past year or two? TNDC is the first affordable housing developer in the US to join Living Building Challenge with 4 pilot projects in one go. We don't know the full trajectory, but that's the conviction that we got with all our stakeholders. And you can see on the slide the architects involved and our design teams, where they're going to really focus on materials as key aspect, though they're looking at all petals holistically as part of the Living Building Challenge, which in my opinion is one of the most aggressive standards right now for the built environment. So I would just like to end saying that material health, I think it's a journey. Like I said, depending on where you are, the context, and where you want to go, and it's not a destination. So TNDC's work that I presented, I think it's just the beginning, and I'm hoping they're going to take this further. So thank you, and I'm going to pass it to Jack.
Oh, still learning Zoom and unmuting apparently. But thanks, Regina. That's a perfect lead into, I think both you and Mallow have emphasized the importance of really holistic thinking with this. Let me just go into presenting. Is this presenting the right screen now? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think we've seen a lot of really, just amazing progress in all kinds of areas over the last 5, 10, 20 years or so, where, thanks to some of the major organizations that are leading this too, from Carbon Leadership Forum to USGBC to AIA, we're really pushing these kinds of metrics forward. But just like the Living Building Challenge, looking at things holistically, I think, and Mal was painting this picture of every one of these issues is so important We don't want to be making concessions or having to make trade-offs between choosing between equality or the future of climate or the health of individuals. So really, how can we think about all of these issues holistically? And I just want to thank Brian too for leading and organizing all of this and for reaching out, because this is such an important prompt and it's such an amazing cast of characters that we brought together for this. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a lot of people from diverse backgrounds, perspectives. So excited for the next 5 parts as well. But so today I'll show a little bit of the framework that I've been working on with Brightworks Sustainability. Also, a lot of credit to Jeff Frost there, huge credit to Jeff Frost there. I was really the brains behind this, this framework and what has been a materials scoring tool primarily. And I will say, when Jeff introduced the framework to me, the scoring tool is definitely hugely actionable and helpful for designers to be able to make comparison. But it was almost the framework or the structure behind the tool that that really got me interested, because he had taken really all of the different metrics that are used to evaluate materials and brought them together into one singular type of framework and start to organize all these variables. So at the highest level, we're able to organize those in 6 primary categories, from health or human health, carbon, circularity, water, waste, and social equity. And then from there, being able to break down each of these categories into more nuanced or granular details into secondary and then tertiary categories. So you start to frame all of these issues that we're talking about in a way that kind of just presents it and gives it context. And I also want to highlight too that these aren't just, well, there's some certifications or proprietary certifications that are multivariable and they're holistic, thinking about the living product challenges and the cradle to cradles. I think the real beauty of what he laid out was that it's non-proprietary. It's looking at universal concepts rather than these proprietary standards. So when we think of something like red list compliance, which is one of the 72 tertiary categories here, we have ILFI's red list as a primary and a stellar example of a red list, but there's also Perkins and Will's precautionary list, the 6 classes. Green Screen has 39 individual lists that they're screening against. So there's so many different things that we're trying to evaluate here, and especially in the US, or at least from my knowledge in the US, there's so little federal regulation that we have this explosion of proprietary standards. So to be able to have one non-proprietary sort of universal scene for context, you can start to evaluate how all these different standards come into play. So that's really what we're starting to show here, of how we have all these primary categories and secondary categories and all these different certifications come into it. And I'm not joking, there's literally more than 200 different certifications and standards, not only that are going into this, but there's a report from 3XN GXN that said there's more than 600 green material health or material certifications out there. So for your average designer or average anybody to be making sense of all of these is virtually impossible. And we're saying that everybody needs to be doing this. So again, to that point Mal was making about, like, we need to figure out who is supposed to be responsible for doing what roles. And we need to be able to make this easier if we really want to get the adoption that we need as an industry or as a everybody. So from this way of kind of contextualizing and orienting certifications, you then are able to kind of compare what some of these mean against each other. So if we have categories like inventory and disclosure, and we know that can be tracked through health product declarations, through declare labels, or through kind of basic things like SDS, material safety data sheet, that kind of stuff, can have this metric of which ones are better than others. A complete HBD, fully disclosed, 100 parts per million, that is very different than an SDS that's meeting the bare minimum. So you start to be able to have these different metrics for evaluating common variables. You can differentiate products that are kind of just scraping the bottom, and those that are really outstanding that are hitting these metrics. And so all of this comes together in this really detailed kind of comparison and score sheet, where you're able to see all these primary categories and secondary categories, and it wouldn't fit on the screen, but there's tertiary categories. And and kind of be able to compare how a product is in health from one to the next, or in carbon, and see at an overall level what how it's doing, but then also at the more granular breakdown, these kind of comparative metrics that are really important too when you're looking at what variables we're talking about. So it's not only very detailed, but what actually got me interested, or there's a lot of things, but the fact that it then summed up, or there's that accordion, expand, collapse, that you both had the detailed view and you could sum it up into this high level understanding. So you could see at a really almost like intuitive level how a product's doing in all these expansive material categories, and giving context for why it is doing that well. So Crossville Tile 2 is an amazing example of one of the leading tile manufacturers, but to be able to say, oh, why are they doing so good in this category? And then it contextualizes the kinds of health, carbon circulated, the different certifications that they have. So it kind of gives a framing and metrics to be able to then build into the narrative. So with that high level understanding, was just thinking what that could mean to the design process and who it really affects. So if we think of, we're trying to make this more actionable. We're trying to make better decisions easier for really everybody, but this could be incorporated incredibly early on. So this was an example of one of the things we were doing at Parsons, the Dongia Healthier Materials Library there, starting to label product samples with these kinds of metrics. So you could say at the first point of contact, when you're just starting to put together a sample palette and putting together a board, you can make that decision right then and there of what products are probably going to be considerably better. Start to rule out ones that are significantly worse, and kind of guide your direction from those very first stages, and then get into those more detailed comparisons. So from the individual high-level scores to then getting translating more into the online database where you're having the additional information and can break these down into more nuanced comparisons. But again, gradually expand into more detail and more metrics as you're going through the process, as you're going through different experience levels of who's on the team and who's working on this, to be able to then evaluate or potentially evaluate your full bill of materials and all the products that are going into a project. And when you're looking at the project level, this is where it starts to really be able to, I think, paint a full picture of kind of the overall status, or how you're doing maybe on a given project, and kind of sets a baseline. And then from one project to the next project, say, were we able to improve, or what areas did we improve in? How did we do overall for this year? Can we improve to the next year? You can kind of gradually track progress as a firm and make this something that you're really able to not just anecdotally say, yeah, we did great, or we did a couple of these good projects, but maybe it was just for those high profile clients, or was in select areas, but you could really evaluate everything across the board of what you're doing. So from there, that's where it started to really become a cultural kind of shift of being able to be self-reflective and evaluate. And on that note too, it's important, like I feel like the real potential was being able to then ingrain it in your firm culture and practices. So of course, with the Health and Materials Library, had to make this 6-foot wheel version of it, so it was front and center and obvious. But I'm not joking, I think that was one of the most important things. If you walk into that room and you're reminded immediately of what the mission statement is and what our material objectives are about, it's also a handy reference tool that you can go and look and see what kind of things you might be interested in. And it does spin if you just want to have some fun. But then we're also building out the kind of educational guides for each of these as well. So to me, this was the bones of this framework, were really kind of the potential to be the full system. I mean, it has the basic intuitiveness and the actionability. It's obviously the holistic, addressing different types of impacts. It's scalability from being able to assess individual products to entire projects to profiles. And it really allows for, like Ruchi said, this is really a journey. It's not just a singular metric. So if we can provide ways of allowing people to just start getting into this, and people with don't have much experience to be starting to be able to do this, but still carrying through to the highest level of expectations, I think that's how we really get significant progress. And there's a lot of momentum right now in this determination for holistically healthier materials. So like Mala mentioned, the AIA pledge, which is now nationally adopted as the AIA pledge as of last November, has been a huge point of garnering in momentum and traction in this industry, and putting forth 5 very similar objectives of human health, climate health, ecosystem health, social health and equity, and a circular economy. And at that point, even had 90+ firms that had signed on to this kind of mission. In a similar way, we also have more holistic tools that are emerging, not emerging because this is 7 years in the works at this point, but so Mindful Materials has been, I think, the premier database that's starting to bring all these variables together. Again, we have these same 5 points that the AIA pledge has put forward. And again, there's conscious efforts to be aligning with this framework, but it's getting all these different certifications that were proprietary and disparate, and everyone had their own website and database, then bringing them to one consolidated place so that architects and designers can be working based in concepts and not proprietary standards, potentially. And while Mindful Materials has a library and is known for that as a tool or a service, it is so much more than that. And I mean, from the early days of starting being developed at HKS as really a kind of I'm underselling this, but a binder labeling system, just a way to kind of communicate things on your product sample, to really this amazing hub where it's getting people of all different industry backgrounds and expertise together to be able to work on these efforts that really take a lot of different perspectives. And it takes the people that are the industrial chemical hygienists, and it takes the architects, and it takes designers, it takes the owners and the reps and manufacturers, like, of course, but it needs to be a very multi-pronged stakeholder engagement, and that's really what Mindful Materials is more than anything. It's people working together from all different organizations, all different backgrounds, sharing their resources, contributing to a common system. So this is just a sample of the working groups that are involved here. You can see it spans all kinds of initiatives, and there's a place for everyone really to be involved in this kind of work. And lastly, just a sample from our most recent working group meeting, where there were, I think, 70, 80+ A&D members on the call from, again, probably just as many firms that are working together to try to address what the current barriers are in the market and what the solutions we need to address. So on that note of the importance of collective action in this, want to not leave, but I guess start the series with a few primary questions that I think we're trying to address in all of this work. 1, how can we consider material impacts more holistically? 2, how can we scale widespread adoption? And 3, how can we leverage collective empowerment? And I think all 3 of those need to really be considered concurrently to be able to drive progress in the industry. So again, huge thanks to everyone. Excited now for the panel discussion and bringing all this together. Again, many thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Ruchi. It was fantastic. It was a great start to the series. We're going to start the panel discussion. The 2 documents that we put out, the contact sheet and the meeting notes document, should be accessible now. So you can go ahead and check that out. Please jot down questions or comments or whatever. You can use the comment and reply tool to kind of build off of each other. The goal here is really to walk away from this series with working groups, with new programs and new initiatives, because like every speaker has said today, this is not going to be dealt with in one presentation, probably not even in, you know, all 6 episodes. So with that, you can add in your questions in the chat as well. I'll pick those up after we start working through some of the prompts. The first question I have for all of you, for all of the speakers, is I want to place you in the shoes of a young designer or a new recruit to a affordable housing agency, or a student at school who really cares about healthy materials, but doesn't really know how to bring it up to their bosses, doesn't really know how to start this conversation, and is looking for low-hanging fruit that they can use to kind of convince. So I'll push it off to Ruchi first. How do us young people get into this conversation? How do we push the needle?
Yeah, and I think not a long time ago, I was in the same boat, right? When I joined the affordable housing sector, I would always hear like, oh, we don't have budgets, we cannot do this and that will be there always. So I think maybe come with that mindset and accept that as a fact. But when it comes to materials, I think about incremental changes, right? Like if your organization is doing good on paints, great. What's the second thing you can introduce them? Sort of, it's through education, through nudges, and I would say incremental changes. Like if you know about materials, if you go to an organization, say, change your design standards totally, they're not gonna be happy with you, even though you bring that enthusiasm and knowledge, right? So I think that's how I approached, like I took step by step and understanding where's the low-hanging fruit. Also, other learning on sort of this journey was, don't make everyone research things. Like, what are things that are easy to implement, or like give them options. Also, like design teams, they don't like saying, you just have to use this product. Give them options for incremental changes. So I would leave there. I think others may have better advice too, but that's what I did.
Yeah, well, if I may go next, I mean, I would agree very much with what you said, Ruchi. I think you have to start with where you are, right? So I've actually had some examples of this with a former student of mine at Berkeley in public health, and also in the College of Environmental Design, who's had a summer internship in an architecture firm. And the firm was really questioning this kind of work, but they thought, we'll take a chance. This person's really smart. And they said, okay, if you can first start to do the research, we will have open mind about it. So she started with the research and then started with one project, right? And so really with a case-by-case basis, literally a case-by-case basis, to make the argument for this. And there are other people I've heard from. So there's an engineer that I just heard from named Laura in the Bay Area, who's interested in this, and it's coming from a natural disaster, or if there's no such thing, I guess, no natural disaster, but from more of a disaster perspective of how we are damaging the planet and what that overall cost is to society. And so you can also make the cost benefit analysis. But I would say within a firm setting or within a government agency, you really do have to do the research and just make the case and build from there. And so I'll leave it at that. But I think what Ruchi has said, I agree very much with.
Yeah, and just add on to the hybrid there of things that both Mel mentioned earlier, of the almost internalizing it and finding that kind of mission. I think sort of nothing that I spoke towards today of these metrics and standards and everything, but really like, what is this significance and humanizing it? And that's where I'll say I got into this because of that story of the effect it has on kids. I was working on a project for kids 6 weeks old to 5 years old, one of the most vulnerable populations, that when you also talk about how this affects them, it pulls on heartstrings. It gets people engaged. I mean, we had contractors that were leading initiatives with all these kids, and they were committed. Like I think more than another session can talk about that. But yeah, to get into the real humanizing of why this matters. But not only painting it as this kind of like really intense, disastrous picture that might be real, but like Ruchi said, also giving options. I think for a little bit, we were just saying like the first year or two is sort of policing and telling people things they can't do or shouldn't do. But now we do have options for most of these things. And then usually often affordable options too. I mean, the market really has come so far in recent years that as soon as a couple products enter, there's competition. And now in most primary product categories or the high impact ones, we do have several material options that are affordable and are healthier. So at least balancing the reality of it with positivity and actionability is a good way for anyone, but particularly young designers, to kind of present this to a crowd.
And may I just add one more thing I first say, is also to reach out, right? Reach out to other colleagues, because sometimes you might be in a place that really is all about the bottom line, but you should also keep your network strong with people who are like-minded, because you won't feel like you're just an island trying to push these things in front of. There are a lot of people who think like you. There are a lot of people out there trying to do this, and there may be ways to leverage that in your own work.
Great responses. The next question I have, sort of zooming out, but also zooming in. Mal, you talked about regional development as one of the target sort of audiences of where we need to look. I've heard the question though, at the same time, is regional codes are kind of prohibitive in a sense that for manufacturers who operate globally, for them to need to change to adjust for a local code that's not applied elsewhere, that's cost them a lot of money and a lot of time, and so they'll push back on that. And so one of the arguments is that, you know, local codes aren't going to be good enough. We need to have international codes. And until there are international codes, I'm not going to do anything about it.
Right.
So how do we, first of all, is that even a correct, like, how do we respond to that argument? Is that argument truly valid? And if there's parts of it that are valid, how do we address those?
So no, I think that is a valid, sort of the chicken and egg thing, right? But I think it's valid, but that can't stop us. So you have organizations that I mentioned before, like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that has brought, they have the Circular Economy 100. These are some of the largest companies in the world, from Nike to Renault to Google to a whole bunch of others that are all part of this, saying they'll be committed to try to do things differently. So we're really talking about economies of scale, right? And moving massive amounts of money, whether we're talking about procurement and whatnot. And so that's an ongoing struggle, but let's not forget the power of us as consumers, to think about what we buy, to be conscious of that, to advocate for what we want. And, you know, you can shift things. So I do a lot of work in the food systems industry. And well, yes, we know that those traditional food manufacturers have been doing things a certain way, especially when it comes to school food, school meals, right? But if you have a state like California that says, now we're going to do California food for California kids, which is basically serving locally sourced healthy food, you move the needle when you're talking about millions of school children, millions of dollars. You then can start to have the largest food producers to say, oh, wait, we can meet your needs. We can think about meeting your demands. So perfect example, if you look at Oakland Unified School District, many years ago on Earth Day, they wanted to find out where their food came from. Well, lo and behold, asparagus was grown in South America, flown to China for packaging, then flown all the way to the Bay Area, some 17,000 miles, where asparagus is grown right in California. And so it's those types of things that we can do, from whether it be from food to the building materials to the things we actually buy for our homes, that could start to make the difference.
To add to Maro's point, I think also at TNDC, the approach that we took was, how can we be, even though we are a relatively small regional San Francisco-based organization, how can we support national initiatives? As I think on sort of the moving the needle piece, I think it's a collective effort. And that's why Home Free is an example. And I would really urge for people in their spheres of influence, think about how can we partner with more people? It may not be necessarily for that same product or for that same sort of issue, but I think things are so interrelated. And that's where I feel like collective power makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Just adding one regionalization piece too, that I think it's more foreshadowing of speakers that I'm really excited for in future series. Where you think about some of the work of like Mass Design Group, who they're not playing by the book that we're all using for this kind of commercial interior standards, but when they are engaging a community, it's so hyper local and figuring out what the local materials, the craftsmen and skill sets, it's all about locality and the differences that come with that. So I think that's where it's exciting as an architecture or a designer, that you're not just following these rules or having to abide by the regulations or lack of regulations that may exist in your area, but that's where you get to be a little creative with figuring out alternative solutions to issues that really matter locally with local solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this kind of answered one of the questions that came in the chat. They said, how do we make it easier for local government implementation, specifically cooperative purchasing agreements, template RFPs, greening contracts, cost benefit analysis research, building a case for support, etc. Is there anything you guys want to add to that?
I guess just that it's all those things, and that's why I want to be advocating for both mindful materials and groups, and what mindful materials is. Like it really is. When we say that this issue is not a small one, that we're trying to address both all of these holistic issues, but any kind of solution is going to need the strategies that work for intro level and for the highest level experience. You need the materials database that goes with it, the tech partner, the education. They're so complex and multifaceted that there's no way any organization can do them alone, because even the most advanced, highest profile individual partners have tried to develop this and that hasn't worked. But the ones that have succeeded are the ones that are collaborative and that are, that are collective. So just that I completely agree that there is lots of this, but looking towards these major industry collaborations for these resources and to even bound together. Like AIA is leading this charge now, but if AIA is the only one, if they're just talking to themselves doing it, we need everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And to add to Jack's point, I think one approach that at TNBC we thought about is vocalizing and really sharing out there, honestly, what's working, what's not working, and what we need in our sort of San Francisco hyperlocal environment. The collaboration piece also came in sort of very closely to us when these 4 projects that signed up for the Living Building Challenge. And the good thing is, as part of that pilot program, we have access to a network. It's a national network where we get to talk to each other about local issues, national issues, and then what others are doing. So learning from that perspective. And the thing that we did at TNBC is we made these 4 teams. Actually, in theory, they don't get to talk to each other much. They all are focusing on their projects. So through this effort, we tried to get them together and talk about their work and their challenges, and it was great. Someone was researching a healthy window, and that another team could just tag on and say, okay, why not we use this, right? So that was, I think, the value of collaboration for me.
Mm-hmm. Great answer. I'm going to zoom in now and talk specifically about materials. There are so many, parts of the material process that are hidden. This is the whole thing about embodied carbon, is that you don't really know, you don't really see it. We're only just now creating environmental product declarations that illuminate part of this process, but even then there's this sort of emotional attachment to that part. Seeing a cement manufacturing facility next to a home is, just eye-opening in itself. How do we open and expose the externalities of materials to build awareness within our industry and within the consumers? Who wants to take that one on?
Just that one. I'll highlight a couple amazing resources that are starting to do this. So I think there's I'm come from material health mostly, where a lot of the times we're looking at product ingredient labels, and what you're seeing on there is the product ingredients at gate, after production, what's going to go into the building. So the materials that are going to affect occupants, and that's not covering those that are exposed in the manufacturing and production cycles mainly. Like if there's a chemical reaction that happens, then it's bad for a lot of people in those communities, but it's cured or inert by that point, it's not showing up there. So looking at kinds of, like Richie mentioned, the Home Free database, which points out types of materials that you can say, you know what, PMMA solid surface, or like your Corian type thing, that HPD or clear label is not going to show up in red list ingredients. But knowing that PMMA and acrylic is always manufactured and at that stage of production always has these kinds of issues, you know that that kind of solid surface is going to have effects on fence line communities or front line communities. And so knowing more about specific product types. And then there's also things like the social hotspots database, which is really tracking what kind of areas are more vulnerable to this and where there is manufacturing happening. Again, highlighting DuPont as an area where along the Cancer Valley area of the Mississippi River, I think there's something like 700 manufacturing plants along this stretch. And there's a cluster right outside the DuPont plant that was making neoprene that had cancer rates 50 to 100 times higher than average. So yeah, I think knowing more about materials and then also using some of these social hotspots can start to clue into those issues that might not show up on the label.
Yeah, Brian, I think this is a hard one. I don't feel like I have a straight answer. One example that came to my mind is I was with my husband watching this Dark Waters documentary, and not to sort of promote or do bashing, but I think it's the curiosity of and willingness to find out more things. Often we just settle by whatever's easily shown to us, right? So it's asking questions and curiosity. That's how I'm trying to find, like, what are the negative impacts of our decisions as a decision maker?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just add to what my colleagues have said is, I would say also community organizing, right? Engaging community residents and engaging the local population and trying to make sure that they're fully aware of what the exposures are in their community. I mean, they oftentimes know, right? And I think it's being able to use our privilege in our positions of power where we are to work with residents to help in that case, and not sort of drop in and be the savior, but more to be partners in this and say, look, we can help you. We work with you. We need to elevate what you're doing and share space with them to be able to, try to make those changes that are necessary.
I want to move now to collaboration. It's been touched on a few times here. Luckily, we have two people here who have touched both the professional world and the university world in terms of research. And I want to talk about that from an architect's point of view. There's often a criticism that says that academy often fails to connect to the professional world, that ideas don't necessarily translate to reality. And I want to talk about that in terms of Malo and Jack. How do you bring research from the university sector over into the professional sector? How do we bridge that gap and make sure that those changes actually occur, actually become policy, or actually become buildings?
That's a great question. I love that question because academia has been terrible at translating our research into real world practice or to partnering with people. But luckily, I had the opportunity at Columbia for the last 2 years to be in the office of the president for an initiative called Columbia World Projects, where I was the director of project development, taking all of the scholarship from the humanities to the medical school to try to address real world issues. So a couple of things that are necessary for that to work is these kind of projects or research efforts have to be collaborative across campus, many disciplines, not just one discipline, but many. They also have to have outside partners who are equal partners in the process, and then to be able to engage the private sector, government, nonprofit sectors as well. And lastly, I'd say what's necessary is to have real objectives of how are you going to measure whether you've had an impact or not. In our case, we were looking at 3 to 5 years. That impact could be negative or positive, because sometimes you think, oh, you're doing a great thing. It actually has negative consequences. So you need to be able to measure that, how you're going to measure it, what those metrics are going to look like over time. But more importantly, or most importantly, I'd say, is you have to get out of the academy, the ivory tower, so to, if you will, to connect with people who are doing this work on the ground. Because it's one thing to theorize about it, it's another to actually practice it. And if you can take both of those and put them together, you actually might be able to create something that may not be maybe not be the best solution if there's such a thing, but it'll be maybe a better solution to some of the challenges we're trying to face.
Yeah, and so coming from both experience as a student and in master's, and it's like coming out of grad school and realizing, well, sort of knew it, but that cost and financial implications were going to be one of the biggest guides on any given project, and that in the accreditation framework, they rule against being able to incorporate these kinds of considerations directly into curriculum. Like it's intentionally not included that we're learning about costs and how to deal with this kind of thing. And to me, I was personally upset that it felt like I was then not prepared to address really anything in practice, and you're not designing things that are affordable or that have any considerations for affordability. And I feel like that is I want to say is a valid criticism of current educational frameworks, that when we're not considering affordability in a real way, it's like ignoring gravity when you're learning about key architectural concepts. A lot becomes irrelevant. But on the other hand, one of the things that was so hard ingrained in me is a lot what Ma was talking about. A big highlight to Parsons School of Design for the kind of social equity mindset and just social awareness that went into everything, and the ability to just really think more, to have empathy and to think about different perspectives. I went there because they have a design build workshop that's building things in the New York City area. So yeah, I think there's some definitive or real criticisms of specific skill sets that might not be learned that are critical, but also just this kind of thought of like being more open-minded and being engaged in certain issues that are important for all of us to learn about.
Yeah. I just want to give a shout out to our colleague Indu Chakravarti, who had this great comment in the chat about this as well, really kind of picking up what Jack left off by saying, you know, how industry and academia are different, but we have to meet in the middle. And so take a look at that comment if you haven't seen it. That's a good point.
And just to add a quick point, I think some organizations or sort of research institutions, I think if they can step up more on how to engage stakeholders and sort of being on the receiving end, where we can use this research and put into practice, is sort of, to Indu's point, understanding what will work for us. Would the timeline work? Is it easily available? Things like that. We can, I think, help each other in that area.
Yeah, and they also have the benefit of being an unbiased source of information. I think both my being working at Parsons Health and Materials Lab and Harvard's Office for Sustainability, one of the biggest assets that people sort of trust you, that you're able to kind of give information and give advice from an unbiased point of view because you're genuinely just trying to help people with the most accurate sciences that you know. So for institutions to take a leadership effort in this kind of bringing people together, feels like they can do it without that kind of ego or incentives that might not be prevalent from others.
Mm-hmm. All right, it is 6:27. I want to give all of you a moment to give closing thoughts before we head out. So Mallow, why don't you take the first stab?
I just think that, you know, no matter what discipline we're coming from or what our professional training is, to really understand what we bring to the table and then try to see it from other people's perspective, the same challenge or issue that we're trying to address, and be willing to get out of our comfort zone to work together to try to address some of these issues.
Yeah, no, let's not forget it's a journey, like I said earlier, and at least I hope you all can engage more as part of the series.
Yeah, and I'll say as a collective, hoping that we can do more that's open, sharing, collaborative, and as an individual, just don't be afraid to start. Like Ruchi kept saying, like just start on this path and go from there.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for joining. Thanks, Ruchi, Jack, Mallow, for speaking. This was a great start to the presentation, to the series. Our next event is on June 7th on structural materials. We'll start the deep dive into healthy materials and start thinking about specifics, which I'm really excited about. For that, we have speakers from the Carbon Leadership Forum, from Mass Design, and hopefully a speaker from Durban, South Africa, which will be really fantastic to talk about policy. If you are curious about checking out the recording of this or checking out the meeting notes or or the contact list, all of it is going to be available on the Healthy Materials landing page on the CLF website. We'll be sending out emails to follow up, and thank you all. Hope you have it. I hope you really enjoyed it.